There was a time when 400 horsepower was considered excessive, not exciting, excessive. It was the point where cars stopped being sensible and started attracting attention from insurers, regulators, and accident investigators. Today, 400 horsepower barely registers. In the last decade, manufacturers have released muscle cars with 700, 800, even 1,000 horsepower, sold new with warranties to people who have never driven anything remotely like them, not race cars, not track specials, road cars, daily drivable, air-conditioned machines capable of reaching dangerous speeds. With almost no effort, what changed wasn't just technology. It was restraint. This surge in power didn't happen because drivers suddenly needed more of it. It happened because manufacturers realized this was the final window. Emissions rules were tightening, electrification was coming, and the old muscle car formula was running out of time, so they stopped holding back. Rivalries escalated, numbers became headlines, engineers were told to make it faster, stronger, louder, and worry about the consequences later. The result is a short, violent era of modern muscle cars that will never be repeated, cars so powerful they challenge the idea of what usable even means. Today, we're looking at the most insanely powerful modern muscle cars ever built and why this level of excess marks the end, not the peak of the muscle car story. To understand why modern muscle cars became this powerful, you have to understand what the industry was trying to outrun. By the late 2000s, traditional muscle cars were on borrowed time, fuel economy regulations were tightening, emissions targets were no longer theoretical, they were enforced with fines severe enough to kill entire platforms. At the same time, electrification was no longer a concept car fantasy, it was coming whether manufacturers liked it or not. This created a paradox. On paper, engines were supposed to shrink, power should have dropped, cars should have become quieter, softer, and more efficient. Instead, muscle cars went in the opposite direction. The reason was forced induction. Turbocharging and supercharging allowed manufacturers to meet emissions rules while quietly unleashing enormous power. Smaller engines could now make bigger numbers, and computers could manage combustion, cooling, traction, and stability far better than any human driver ever could. Power was no longer dangerous because electronics could hide it until the moment you asked for everything. At the same time, something else changed. Automatic transmissions stopped being a compromise. Dual-clutch gearboxes and fast-shifting torque converters became quicker than manuals, more durable under extreme torque, and far easier to market to a broader audience. That removed the last barrier between huge power and mass appeal. Then came the arms race. One manufacturer released a headline number, another refused to be second. Marketing departments learned that horsepower figures traveled faster than engineering explanations, and buyers responded. Even people who never intended to use that power wanted to know it was there. Crucially, everyone involved understood this was temporary. Engineers knew electrification would end this era, executives knew the regulatory window was closing, and enthusiasts sensed it too, even if they couldn't articulate it yet. That knowledge removed restraint. There was no reason to save anything for later because there was no later, so modern muscle cars became monuments to excess. Not because the world needed them, but because this was the last moment when the industry was still allowed to build them, and the first car to prove just how far things could go didn't come from a laboratory, it came from a company that decided subtlety was pointless. Dodge Challenger Cert Hellcat. When Dodge unveiled the Challenger Cert Hellcat in 2015, the industry didn't react with admiration, it reacted with silence, because 707 horsepower wasn't just high, it was disruptive. It didn't fit into any existing logic, no track day justification, no lightweight philosophy, no lap time excuse. Just a heavy old-school coupe with a supercharged V8 producing more power than most contemporary Ferraris, and Dodge priced it so normal people could actually buy one. That was the real provocation. The Hellcat's 6.2-liter supercharged Hemi V8 delivered 707 horsepower and 650 lb-ft of torque through the rear wheels alone. No all-wheel drive, no apology. A simple message, figure it out. 0 to 60 arrived in the low 3-second range on a good surface, but numbers missed the point. What mattered was how effortlessly it delivered violence. This was not a precision instrument. It was an event. Underneath, the engineering was brutally honest: massive cooling capacity, oversized brakes, strengthened driveline components that still lived on borrowed time. Dodge didn't try to disguise the car's mass or pretend it was agile. They leaned into it. The Hellcat wasn't about corners, it was about domination in a straight line and intimidation everywhere else. But the reality of ownership arrived quickly. Rear tires became consumables. Fuel economy collapsed the moment boost appeared. Insurance premiums climbed into absurdity, and many owners discovered that full throttle in second gear wasn't thrilling, it was terrifying. The car didn't feel wild at idle, it felt wild when you asked to. Much of it, which is exactly when most drivers weren't ready. Mechanics noticed something else. Hellcats weren't unreliable in the traditional sense. They failed because people used them exactly the way Dodge advertised them. Heat cycles, driveline shock, tires overwhelmed constantly. This wasn't fragility, it was consequence. And yet the Hellcat changed everything. Suddenly, horsepower bragging rights mattered again. BMW M cars looked conservative. AMG had to respond. Ford tore up its restraint playbook. Chevrolet realized numbers alone weren't enough anymore. The Hellcat didn't just restart the muscle car war, it redefined what winning looked like. But Dodge wasn't satisfied, because once you've proven 700 horsepower is possible, the only question left is how far past sensible you're willing to go. Dodge Challenger Cert Demon 170. If the Hellcat was Dodge tearing up the rulebook, the Demon was Dodge setting the rulebook on fire and asking regulators to watch. Unveiled in 2018, the Challenger Cert Demon wasn't a faster Hellcat, it was something far more uncomfortable, a factory-built drag car with number plates. Dodge didn't pretend otherwise. They engineered it for one purpose, and one purpose only: maximum acceleration over a quarter mile, with no concern for versatility, subtlety, or public perception. Under the bonnets at a heavily reworked version of the Hellcat's 6.2-liter V8, now producing 840 horsepower on race fuel, with torque figures that strained the limits of language, not just components. The Demon introduced systems no production road car had ever shipped with before: a factory trans brake, torque reserve strategies, and software that actively prepared the drivetrain for violent launches. Even the wheels told the story: skinny front tires, drag radials at the rear. Dodge openly encouraged owners to drive to the strip, run an 11, and drive home, something that made sanctioning bodies deeply uncomfortable. The NRA famously banned the Demon for being too fast without additional safety equipment, a moment that perfectly summarized how far Dodge had gone. But the most unsettling part wasn't the numbers, it was how easy Dodge made it look. The Demon could run sub-10-second quarter miles in the right conditions with minimal driver input. No skill curve, no heroic driving, just preparation, commitment, and faith that the electronics would keep everything pointing straight. Muscle cars had always been about bravado, but this removed even that. The car did the hard work for you. Ownership stories followed quickly. Tires vanished in weekends. Drivetrain components wore rapidly under repeated launches. Insurance companies quietly declined coverage, and many owners realized something uncomfortable. The Demon wasn't fun in the traditional sense. It was thrilling in short, violent bursts and exhausting everywhere else. Dodge didn't care. Because the Demon wasn't built to be loved daily, it was built to make a statement. And when electrification pressure intensified, Dodge doubled down one last time. In 2023, the Demon 170 arrived, effectively a farewell note written in tire smoke. Running on E85, it delivered 1,025 horsepower, lifting the front wheels under hard acceleration. 1,000 horsepower muscle car sold from a dealership, backed by a warranty that quietly assumed owners would show restraint. They didn't. The Demon 170 wasn't engineering progress, it was defiance. Dodge knew this era was ending. They knew internal combustion muscle cars were living on borrowed time, so instead of tapering off, they went out at full throttle, leaving no room for escalation. After the Demon, power figures stopped being shocking, because once you cross 4 digits, numbers lose meaning. But not everyone followed Dodge into chaos. Some manufacturers chose a different path: not less power, but more control. Ford Mustang Shelby GT500, where Dodge chased excess, Ford chased control. The Shelby GT500 that arrived for the 2020 model year wasn't E4's answer to the Hellcat in the way many expected. Yes, it made 760 horsepower from a supercharged 5.2-liter V8, but the headline number wasn't the story. The story was how deliberately Ford chose to use it. This was the most powerful production Mustang ever built, and Ford treated that fact like a responsibility, not a marketing stunt. The GT500's Predator V8 was hand-built, rev-happy, and brutally over-engineered. It produced less torque than Dodge's Hemi but delivered it with far more precision. Power went through a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, a decision that angered purists but made the car devastatingly effective. Shifts happened faster than any human could manage, and the gearbox removed hesitation from the driving experience entirely. This wasn't a straight-line monster pretending to tolerate corners. It wanted them. Magnetic ride control, massive brakes, and obsessive cooling meant the GT500 could repeat performance without collapsing under heat. Track-focused variants proved it could lap circuits all day, humiliating cars that were supposed to be lighter, purer, and more sophisticated, and yet it never felt as intimidating as the Hellcat. That was the irony. Ford's electronics didn't just intervene, they guided. Traction systems allowed drivers to explore the edge without instantly punishing mistakes. The car felt serious, not feral, dangerous only when deliberately provoked. But this discipline came at a cost. The GT500 was expensive, heavy, complex, and emotionally colder than its rivals. Some buyers missed the sense of rawness. Others resented the loss of a manual gearbox, seeing it as the final concession that muscle cars were no longer about mechanical connection. Ford understood this criticism and ignored it, because the GT500 wasn't built to relive the past. It was built to prove something uncomfortable, that modern muscle cars could be engineered. Weapons, not just loud statements. That brute force didn't have to feel clumsy. In many ways, the GT500 was the most mature car of this era, and maturity in muscle car culture is rarely celebrated. Still, its existence forced a reckoning. Power alone was no longer enough. To stand out, muscle cars now had to dominate more than just drag strips. Which brings us to the car that quietly embarrassed Europe on its own terms without chasing outrageous numbers. Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 ZL1. If the Hellcat was about shock and the GT500 was about discipline, the Camaro ZL1 was about something far less marketable: competence. On paper, the ZL1 looked almost restrained: 650 horsepower from a supercharged 6.2-liter V8, rear-wheel drive, manual or automatic, no. Four-figure headline, no outrageous theatrics, and that was exactly why people underestimated it. They shouldn't have, because the ZL1, especially in one form, was the moment American muscle stopped apologizing to European performance cars and started beating them at their own game. Lap times weren't marketing fantasies here. They were proof. This was a car that could run flat out, lap after lap, without melting itself or frightening the driver into backing off. Chevrolet's engineers obsessed over balance. Cooling was everywhere. Aerodynamics were functional, not decorative. The chassis was stiff, communicative, and brutally honest. Where the Hellcat overwhelmed and the GT500 guided, the ZL1 demanded respect. It didn't flatter bad inputs. It didn't hide weight. It simply did what it was told, provided you knew what you were doing. And that, ironically, was its problem. The Camaro ZL1 wasn't dramatic enough for social media. It didn't announce itself with supercharger whine at idle or produce shock and on numbers on spec sheets. It required explanation, and explanations don't sell muscle cars. Owners, however, knew. Track day regulars quickly realized the ZL1 could humiliate cars costing far more. European journalists stopped laughing and started paying attention. The ZL1 became a quiet benchmark, not a poster car but a reference point. Yet sales never matched capability. The Camaro's visibility issues, tight cabin, and lack of emotional theater worked against it. People respected it, but they didn't desire it in the same way, and in the muscle car world, desire matters more than correctness. Still, the ZL1 proved something crucial. Power didn't have to escalate endlessly to remain relevant. Control, consistency, and confidence could be just as devastating. And in doing so, it exposed an uncomfortable truth. The most capable muscle car of this era was also the one least celebrated for it, but modern muscle wasn't finished evolving, because somewhere between brute force and finesse, a different idea emerged, one that proved muscle cars no longer needed two doors to be terrifying.
Cadillac Court 5V Blackwing. The Court 5V Blackwing is one of the most dangerous cars on this list, not because it is the loudest or the fastest in a straight line, but because it hides what it is until it's far too late. On the surface, it looks like a sensible executive sedan, 4 doors, subtle styling, a badge most people associate with comfort rather than aggression, and that's exactly why it works. Underneath, the Blackwing is pure, undiluted muscle, a 6.2-liter supercharged V8 producing 668 horsepower, sent to the rear wheels through either a 10-speed automatic or improbably a 6-speed manual. In an era where manuals are quietly disappearing, Cadillac doubled down and offered one in a 650-plus horsepower sedan. That decision alone tells you who this car was built for. The Blackwing doesn't chase theatrics, it doesn't shout. Instead, it delivers power with an unsettling calm. Acceleration is relentless rather than dramatic. Grip arrives earlier than expected, and when you realize how fast you're actually going, you're already well past sensible speeds. This car exists because a small group of engineers inside General Motors refused to let American performance die quietly. They knew electrification was coming. They knew this might be the last chance to build something unapologetically mechanical, so they built a sedan that could outrun sports cars, carry a family, and still make purists smile. Ownership stories echo the same theme. People underestimate it. Other drivers provoke it. Then reality arrives suddenly. The Blackwing doesn't feel like a compromise. It feels like a loophole, a way to own a muscle car without announcing it to the world. Historically, its significance is enormous. This is likely the final manual V8 Cadillac and possibly the last time a luxury American brand builds something this aggressive without filters. It represents the moment muscle cars stopped being defined by shape and started being defined by intent, and that raises an uncomfortable question. If a Ford or luxury sedan qualifies as a muscle car, what happens to the definition itself? Because once you remove body style, nostalgia, and national identity, muscle becomes something else entirely, and nowhere is that shift more obvious than in the car that forced Americans to admit that muscle power no longer belonged to them alone.
BMW M5 CS. When Europe built a muscle car in a suit, the BMW M5 CS makes a lot of American muscle fans uncomfortable, and not because it is European, because it does the job too well. On paper, the M5 CS doesn't belong in a muscle car conversation. It's a luxury sedan, it has all-wheel drive, it's packed with electronics. And yet, in practice, it behaves exactly like the muscle cars that came before it, just with fewer excuses and far more efficiency. Under the bonnet is a twin-turbocharged 4.4-liter V8 producing 627 horsepower, delivered through an all-wheel drive system that can send most of that power rearward when asked. This isn't a safety net, it's a launch advantage. The M5 CS doesn't struggle for traction. It deploys violence cleanly. 0 to 60 happens in roughly 3 seconds. Passing power feels infinite, and unlike older muscle cars, this performance doesn't arrive with noise, drama, or warning. It arrives quietly, quickly, and repeatedly. That's the unsettling part. Where American muscle announces intent, the M5 CS conceals it. The cabin is calm, the ride is composed, and yet the car will out-accelerate and outpace machines that look far more aggressive. It doesn't ask for bravery, it assumes competence. From a philosophical standpoint, this car marks a shift. Muscle used to be about excess. Overcoming refinement, now refinement delivers excess. Purists argue this disqualifies the M5 CS, but strip away the nostalgia and the bodywork, and what remains is familiar. A powerful V8, a focus on straight-line speed, and an attitude that prioritizes dominance over delicacy. It just happens to do it with German discipline rather than American chaos. Historically, the M5 CS matters because it shows what muscle became when it globalized. Power stopped being regional, engineering stopped being emotional, and the definition of muscle stopped caring about tradition. For American manufacturers, this was a quiet warning. The power war they started no longer belonged to them alone. Others had learned how to build faster cars and how to make them easier to live with, which brings us to the inevitable question. If modern muscle cars are faster, safer, and more capable than ever, why does this era feel so final? Because when everything is controlled, optimized, and filtered through software, something essential disappears, and that's what these cars taken together force us to confront. Look at these cars together and a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every single one relies on forced induction. Every single one uses electronics to make power survivable, and every single one exists because its manufacturer understood that this moment wouldn't last. The Hellcat proved restraint was optional. The Demon proved it could be abandoned entirely. The GT500 showed power could be civilized without being neutered. The Camaro ZL1 demonstrated that competence doesn't need spectacle. The Blackwing proved muscle no longer needed two doors. And the M5 CS showed that once power globalized, tradition stopped mattering. What connects them isn't just horsepower, it's urgency. These cars were built quickly, decisively, and without plans for long-term evolution. There were no gentle power increases queued up for the next decade. No gradual refinement. Each one feels like a final answer, not a stepping stone. And that's because they are. Manufacturers knew emissions rules were tightening. They knew electrification would end internal combustion escalation. And they knew that once the door closed, it wouldn't reopen. So instead of pacing themselves, they spent everything at once. The result is an era defined by excess rather than progression. Modern muscle cars didn't evolve into this point, they lunged toward it. And while that gave us some of the most astonishing road cars ever sold, it also quietly ended the conversation. There's nowhere left to go without changing the rules entirely, which is why, as impressive as these machines are, they don't feel like a peak, they feel like a last stand, and understanding that is the key to understanding what modern muscle really represents. From a distance, this era looks like progress. Horsepower climbed, acceleration improved, reliability increased, electronics made cars safer and faster at the same time. By every measurable metric, modern muscle cars are superior to anything that came before them, but progress isn't the same thing as continuity. What these cars represent isn't the natural evolution of muscle. It is the compression of an ending. Decades of ambition, rivalry, and engineering excess forced into a very short window because everyone involved knew time was running out. That's why these cars feel different. Older muscle cars were flawed, but their flaws were human. You learned them, you adapted to them. Power fell turned because it was difficult to access safely. Modern muscle removes that friction. It delivers extraordinary performance with minimal effort, and in doing so, it quietly changes the relationship between driver and machine. This isn't nostalgia talking, it's context. When power becomes effortless, it stops being the point. The challenge moves elsewhere, to software, to control systems, to restraint, and restraint is not something this segment was ever built around. That's why there won't be a true successor to these cars. Future performance cars will be faster. Electric motors will obliterate these acceleration figures without drama or noise. But they won't replicate the tension, the sense that something mechanical and volatile is being barely contained. These modern muscle cars exist in a narrow space between eras, old enough to still be mechanical, new enough to be artificially controlled, powerful enough to be ridiculous, and brief enough to feel unreal in hindsight. For engineers, they were a farewell experiment. For manufacturers, a final flex. For buyers, often more car than they ever needed. And for history, they will be remembered not as the ultimate expression of muscle, but as the moment muscle burned everything it had left. Because after this, the numbers don't matter anymore. The rules change, the noise fades, and power becomes abstract. Which leaves us with one last question, not about speed or horsepower, but about meaning. If you've ever driven one of these cars, you already know the strange contradiction they create. They are astonishingly capable and strangely unnecessary. They can do things that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago, yet most owners will never come close to using even half of what's available. That doesn't make them pointless. It makes them historical, because these cars weren't built to solve a problem. They were built to make a statement, and statements don't need to be practical. What matters now is how this era is remembered, not through spec sheets or drag strip times, but through real experiences. The first time the tires broke loose unexpectedly, the moment you realized how quickly things could go wrong, or the quiet respect that came from owning something so obviously over-engineered. So if you or your family owned any of these modern muscle cars or something that tried to compete with them, your story matters. Not as bragging, but as record. These machines represent a moment the industry won't revisit. If this kind of deep, context-driven automotive history matters to you, that's what this channel is about. Not hype, not nostalgia for its own sake. Understanding why cars were built the way they were and what they say about the time that produced them. Subscribe if you want more long-form automotive stories told without exaggeration. And in the comments, answer one simple question. Was this era too much, or was it exactly enough? Next time, we'll look at what happened after the power war ended, when speed became silent and the definition of muscle had to change completely.